Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're really excited to talk about one of our favorite topics, attribution, and specifically how attribution relates to understanding overlaps between threat groups tracked by different organizations. Understanding these overlaps can help us properly evaluate and prioritize emerging activity. So for example, let's say I see a new report released by another organization about a new TTP being used by a threat group that has repeatedly targeted my organization. That's going to be of interest to me, and it'll be valuable. But it can also be really challenging. As an analyst, I previously supported the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and a large part of my role was just reviewing, reporting from various sources, and trying to determine what was most valuable to our nation's decision makers. And it got really frustrating trying to determine if all this activity being discussed under different names was really the same set of activity. And I frequently found myself asking, why can't we just all use the same names? Yet after 3 years at Mandiant, I understand why we can't use the same names and why we shouldn't use the same names. So today we're going to be explaining why a comprehensive Rosetta Stone of threat actors is going to remain elusive, and also giving you some tips how you can address this challenge. So right now you might be questioning my assertion that we can't use the same names, and certainly you have seen groups use shared names. The problem is, even when we're using the same names, they don't mean the same thing. So for example, can anyone in this room agree on the boundaries of Lazarus Group? Or what about Carbonac? Is that a malware, an operation, a threat group? Is MageCart a threat group or a technique? Mandiant doesn't adopt third-party threat group names. We have our own designators, UNCs, FINs, and APTs, and that's based on information that we can independently confirm, largely based on our own data sources. We model other firms' assessments, but it doesn't define the threat group. So what about everyone else? As I mentioned, this information can be valuable, it can be challenging, and it's certainly time-consuming. So we continue to receive these requests for Rosetta Stones. So here are some mappings. You've probably seen some things like this. One of them's from MITRE, one's from Mandiant Advantage, and these mappings are helpful, but they're imperfect. They only indicate that there is an overlap between threat groups, not the nature or the extent of the overlap. Illustrations like this get a little bit closer to the truth, but they're still imperfect. What activity and TTPs are shared? What are the notable differences? So there are several reasons that you're never going to have a perfect mapping. And today we'll discuss 4 key causes: attribution threshold, attribution granularity, visibility, and changes over time. But before we get started, I want to discuss a related factor, an organization's use case for attribution. Andrew, can you tell us more?
Awesome. Thanks, Genevieve. Welcome, folks. Thanks for staying for probably the last talk of the day here. Hopefully get you out of here so you can get some drinks. Let's talk about use cases. Defense, imposing cost, and legal considerations. These are 3 buckets that we decided to put up here, but any particular organization could actually work across all of those use cases, or maybe just one. In the case of defense, we're normally creating these clusters or named groups to enable network defense. You're going to be most interested in the TTPs, the tools, the infrastructure, all the things that generally people talk about when they discuss attribution. People talk about the diamond model, et cetera. You're most interested in how they're conducting intrusions, maybe not necessarily the exact person who's doing the intrusion or the country they originate from. When we go on to imposing costs, now you're talking about things like sanctions. You're talking about indictments, possibly doing some meat damage if you're in the military. You're going to be more concerned about the granularity, and you're going to be more concerned about the confidence that you're bringing to that attribution. Legal considerations, also important. If your organization gets crushed by an entity that is sanctioned and they're demanding a ransom, You paying that ransom might put you on the wrong side of the government. Conversely, if you have a situation where your organization gets crushed and the entity is a military, maybe your insurance provider will make the determination that this was an act of war and we're not covering you. So attribution does matter in all of those cases, but each of those is going to come with its own set of confidence levels that Emiel will talk about on the next slide.
Yes, so let's talk a little bit about attribution thresholds. This is the first sort of factor that we want to talk about in terms of why Rosetta Stones can be imperfect. So there's 4 main factors across organizations that we can talk about how different attribution thresholds kind of manifest. The first factor relates to the maturity of the organization. If an organization has been doing this type of analysis for 20 years, has experienced analysts and knowledge of the industry and technology, of course, they will have a higher attribution threshold than an organization who's brand new and only has fresh analysts. The second factor relates to use cases. These are specifically the use cases that Andrew already mentioned, but when you think about the various levels of attribution here, Mandiant can certainly attribute a spear phishing email to a brand new UNC or a pre-existing UNC, right? And when we talk about UNCs, we're thinking about sort of clusters of adversary tradecraft tools and infrastructure. But it's a wholly different thing to attribute a spear phishing email to a sponsoring organization or an individual behind a keyboard. And this latter example will typically be the purview of law enforcement or government organizations that will have different visibility, and we'll get to that a little bit more later. The third factor here is quantity and quality of evidence. It's probably no surprise that if you have a high volume of high quality primary source evidence that will help you in your attribution analysis, you're going to have a higher attribution threshold and a higher standard, but you'll also be able to make those assessments a little bit easier than an organization that doesn't have that same degree and quality of evidence. And then finally, how you weigh the evidence matters as well. Right? Different organizations will define the quality of evidence differently, but will also decide to weigh different pieces of evidence in different ways. One rule of thumb, for example, at Mandiant is that we typically do not do attribution solely based on overlaps in the use of particular malware families. Right? This is because different malware families can be developed by shared developers, shared across different groups, or simply be found on GitHub. So we'll still weigh that evidence differently, right? When we have 2 UNCs that are using the same malware family that appears to be custom developed and only used by them for specific purposes, we'll go ahead and weigh that differently than 2 UNCs that are using Cobalt Strike Beacon, right? So with that said, I'll pass it back to Andrew to talk more about attribution granularity.
Thanks, Emiel. All right, so granularity, what do we mean when we say granularity? We're talking about the bucket, essentially, how big the bucket is or how narrow it is. And on the slide, we've got country, organization, team, individual. Based on your use case, you might not care about one of these, right? If you are in a law enforcement entity, you probably deeply care about individual level attribution. You might have multiple people who you need to track granularly that are a part of a larger team, and maybe another organization only tracks that team. We'll see this in an example here with a real-world use case. We have APT28, which Mandiant says is possibly GRU, so the actual military intelligence agency of the Russian Federation. But beyond that, if we look at country level, we got Russia, Russian Federation, GRU, and then subunits within that, and then members of those subunits. There's probably some veterans or military in the room. You know, as well as anybody else, that people move units on occasion. So if you're tracking an entity by the granular level of the individual, maybe that individual moves around and takes their tools, takes their techniques, takes a password that they use with them to their next unit. There was an article very recently that discussed somebody who decided to go into the GRU as an alternative to being a trigger puller. Great decision on his part. But after he did his time, he went to the FSB. Does he now bring his APT28-ness to the FSB? Probably not. In this case, Mandiant has said GRU possibly for APT28. NSA has named a specific unit, and FBI has gone further and named specific individuals. So who's right? Well, hopefully we consider all of us right, But what happens is the public will conflate those things. They will say, this specific individual is named in this indictment, therefore they are APD 28. What if that person transfers units? Or what if somebody who's not even in that unit is supporting the operation at that time? We have human intelligence officers from different units who will go and support maybe a close access operation. Is that person now APD 28? Maybe. It depends on how you're tracking it. This kind of illustrates some of the points that I was making, but I want to make sure that I'm absolutely clear that I'm not saying that we should track all of Russia's intelligence services as one giant bucket. I don't think that's useful to anybody. However, any one of these characteristics, such as the defense contractor that's supporting all three of them, possibly with training, possibly with tooling, et cetera, those could be artifacts that we observe and say we're going to cluster all of these together, depending on the vendor, right? They could see tools that are produced for all three, and they could look at those technical artifacts and make the case, wouldn't be a good case, but they could make the case that it's the same. Going back to the example that I gave earlier, you have an individual that actually moves entire intelligence agencies. Maybe they bring some characteristics of their operations to there, and it helps muddy some of that attribution. But you also have situations where units are conducting joint or combined operations, and that only manifests a certain way on the wire, right? We can't distinguish necessarily who is physically doing those intrusions. And so when the public says that this unit is APD 28 and this unit is Sandworm, maybe they're occasionally converging in operations, because it's very rare that military units will in fact conduct unilateral operations, right? You're usually having some kind of support from other entities. That was a foreign intelligence entity example. I'm going to turn over to Genevieve for financial crime.
Yeah, we have a lot of the same challenges on the financial crime side. Many threat actors have specialized in just one or two phases of the attack lifecycle, and then they form partnerships with other actors to monetize their operations. And so this is a very oversimplified version of parts of the TrickBot ecosystem that have supported Conti operations. And I just want to talk about how different organizations might view this in terms of grouping or granularity. So in some cases, an organization might consider all of this one cohesive group, like Wizard Spider. In other cases, they might break it down by malware family. So on the ransomware side, you'd have Diavol and Conti and Ryuk. And on the distribution side, maybe TrickBot and Bazaar Loader. Other organizations might focus on the specific individuals supporting this. So some of the examples here are Tramp, Pumbaa, and Skippy, who have supported some of the ransomware negotiations. At Mandiant, we tend to kind of break this up into all of those. So we will track the individuals supporting the operations, and then we'll track the distribution unks or clusters, and we'll track the actual ransomware operators and their affiliates separately. And having that level of granularity can help us better predict and prevent next stages of intrusions. But all of these levels of granularity might work for different organizations depending on their use case. So now I'm going to ask Andrew to talk about the third and perhaps most important factor here, visibility.
Thanks, Genevieve. Visibility. Big fan. I come from the intelligence collection side of the house, not so much on the analysis side. And so visibility is everything, in my opinion. If you do really great collection, it should hopefully make your analysis a little bit easier, because you're not filling that analysis with your own thoughts. You're filling it with raw data. To that end, Mandiant has had a bias towards investigations. We have largely derived our intelligence information from investigating intrusions. Really, really valuable, great insight, rare insight, but it does have limitations. We also have other vendors that primarily derive their data from maybe security appliance telemetry, right? Maybe they offer email security, and so they derive a lot of their insights from initial access. Maybe that initial access looks consistent across multiple groups and things get muddy that way. Really, from our our perspective, we really don't consider our understanding to be comprehensive unless we at least see them hands-on keyboard in an environment, in an actual intrusion. That's where we've really had most of our bread and butter. Some CTI entities are largely tracking this stuff on underground forums. Again, excellent resource, should have collection in that space, but it's not going to really show you how that adversary operates in an intrusion. Arguably, even foreign intelligence services, maybe in the US government, they have excellent upstream insight. They can conduct espionage through technical means or human means, et cetera. But they're still probably limited due to their own domestic authorities on how those adversaries conduct intrusions in victim environments, right? And so we actually do provide a little bit of unique insight from doing those intrusion investigations. Malware analysis, again, Genevieve, Emiel both hit. We don't like to create clusters on malware. Tools can be shared, tools can be leaked, as we've seen. That's something that, it's a great tell if it's something that's believed to be proprietary, but how long does it remain to be proprietary? That's another thing in this space. What's true today might not be true tomorrow, right? So things that are unique to a particular group may not be unique in the coming months. But I did mention state intelligence activities, human intelligence, signals intelligence, and there's a really, really great example of where I believe it's NSA was able to get some unique visibility that we would never have, that shed a lot of light on some of the tools that were being used between Iran and Russia. I'll turn over to Emiel for that.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is quite an interesting example. I really love this one. Perhaps not a super common scenario, but maybe more common than we know. So in October of 2019, the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center and the US's NSA came out with a joint report. And they claimed that the Russia Nexus Turla group had co-opted and stolen and learned how to use various Iranian-developed backdoors. Now, this is really interesting because they didn't just learn how to use them, they also actually scanned across other infrastructure to see if there's pre-existing victims, and then see if they can themselves gain a foothold into those previously compromised environments. And it would also use these Iranian tools or Iranian-developed tools in environments they had previously compromised with their own tool sets. Now, depending on the visibility that you have, you might think, well, that's strange, right? Maybe there's some kind of collaboration going on between Russia and Iran. There's always that possibility in that rumor. Maybe you sit somewhere else and you have certain upstream visibility that the rest of us don't, and you can make this assessment. But in a lot of cases, as a private sector researcher, you might not know this. It might even lead you to assess that your attribution in the past was wrong. Maybe those Iranian-developed tools weren't Iranian in the first place after all. Or maybe this intrusion wasn't actually Turla, Iran just got good all of a sudden, right? We don't know. So it's difficult to make assessments when your visibility is limited, and the better your visibility, the better you'll be at making those attribution assessments correctly. Now, to our point earlier, and to Andrew's point again about we don't necessarily do attribution based solely on malware overlap, that's how we were able to not fall for this false flag and not assume these two sets were the same and kind of tread those waters a little bit more carefully. Now, Genevieve also has an example of how this plays out in the financial crime world.
Thank you. Yeah, over the years, Proofpoint has released some great reporting on the financially motivated threat cluster TA505. And TA505 has significant overlaps with the threat group that Mandiant tracks as Fin11. But there are also some notable differences, and these likely relate to visibility. TA505 has historically conducted widespread phishing campaigns, and many of Proofpoint's offerings are email security. And if you look at the historic information, starting over in 2014, that Proofpoint put out about TA505, Mandiant couldn't independently confirm a lot of that. As we get into about 2018, and Mandiant's making much better use of our telemetry data, those two threat clusters start to look a lot more alike as that activity kind of aligns. Then in 2020, Fin11 or TA505, whatever name you want to use right now, starts to shift their initial access operations away from phishing campaigns into server exploitation. And so we started relying much more on our active collections program and things like our IR data to have insights into what they were up to. And at that point, we saw that our observations of Fin 11 were not really aligning with the TA 505 reporting. So you can see here how you have two very well-respected cybersecurity firms, and they still have different visibility based on things like their products and their services and customer demographics. So now I think we're ready to discuss our final factor, changes over time.
All right, so the fourth factor about relating to why these Rosetta Stones can be imperfect is changes over time. And even with a persistent overarching goal for pretty much any organization, we'll see changes in personnel, resources, and mandates. Right? So when you think about personnel, of course, there's new hires, there's turnover. Like Andrew said, people change units, people change companies. So this might look like to us on the wire, we might see new TTPs. Maybe someone who used to work for whatever APT28 is now works for the SVR, right? And is bringing some tools and some preferences with them. Adversaries are human just like we are. They have preferences. And as people leave, come and go, we can see an evolution in TTPs over time as well. You might not be able to say, hey, some person left, this must be a new TTP because of that, right? But those changes certainly impact what we see. Second, when we think about mandate, I think this is a fairly obvious one. If a sponsoring organization suddenly gets the requirement from their government to start collecting against a new area, a new vertical, or something happens geopolitically, right? And there's a different mandate in place, we might see new strange targeting that we wouldn't normally expect from our favorite APT group, right? So again, we might think something's out of the ordinary. Maybe there's something happening in the back end. And then finally, resources. I mean, if someone tenfolds their budget and hires 2 new malware developers and gets better infrastructure, perhaps does more operations at the same time than they could previously do, again, we might see those changes on the wire as well, but not quite understand why they're occurring. Now I should go back. I mentioned all of this, and this is true for civilian and military intelligence agencies, but it gets worse when you start bringing contractors into the mix. Contractors and any third-party organizations, they bring in flexibility for the sponsor, right? So contractors perform various work for them. They might have different contracts over time. Maybe they work for 2 different sponsoring organizations, right? And so the sponsor doesn't have to hire talent, train them up, try to retain them, right? They also get a little bit of plausible deniability, right? Because they're not actually the people conducting the activity. So this all manifests in a way that makes attribution even more difficult. Because you might be able to attribute some activity to an UNC at the tactical level and think something 2 months later looks the same, but it's actually in support of an entirely different contract, right? So it's extremely difficult to do attribution in that space. A somewhat helpful analogy here is the ship of Theseus. This is a sort of thought experiment where Mr. Theseus in years gone by thought, if I change every component part of my ship one by one, do I still have the same ship? That's the top branch. The bottom branch there, where you end up with ship C, is where you take each of those component parts and build a new ship with it. Now, the thought experiment goes, which one of these is the ship of Theseus? Is either of them or not? There is one particular strand in cognitive science that says, essentially, it doesn't really matter because we shouldn't think of the ship as a thing that should be exactly the same. Rather, it's a continuity in space and time. So the ship still has its elements in the same place. They interact the same way with each other, and they interact with the world the same way. The ship still sails. It's fine, right? So when you bring this back to attribution analysis, you can start kind of thinking about what this means for UNCs or TA groups and so on. Imagine you have APT 99. You've been tracking them since 2015. And you have their targeting down, you have good visibility, you know what their tools are like, you know what their TTPs are like. But suddenly they get 5 new malware developers. A bunch of people leave. They get more budget, so they also get better infrastructure, and they stop using Let's Encrypt certificates, and they move to a better NetBlock, right, a better provider. They change their VPSs more often, and they suddenly have really fancy malware, and they start expanding their targeting because they have more people and an evolved mandate. It's 2025. Now, depending on what visibility you have and what your attribution thresholds and granularity are, you might not track what APT99 is in 2025 as the same cluster in 2015, right? Maybe you're able to, maybe you're not, and this depends on all of these factors. I'll pass it over to Genevieve to give an example of how this works in the cybercrime space.
Yeah, so state-sponsored actors tend to be a little, or the groups tend to be a little bit more static over time, whereas on the cybercrime side, well, it's fluid. Membership can change over time. You can have people working with multiple threat groups at once. And so it's a little tricky. That being said, we have some very short-lived clusters, and we have some that tend to stick around a little bit longer, and we graduate some of those to a named fin group. And the fin groups tend to be more stable over time. More stable being the key part here. We've graduated 13 fin groups, and most of them are now either inactive or so evolved as to not resemble the original group. And so one of the examples we have here is Fin12 and UNC2727. There are significant technical overlaps between these two threat clusters, and we assess with moderate confidence that they have had overlapping membership. But there are also some pretty significant differences related to their operations and timing. For example, Fin12 almost exclusively deployed Ryuk ransomware, and UNC2727 has deployed a variety of ransomware families. Fin12 seemed to have ceased operations around mid-2021, where we have continuing operations with UNC2727. So this could suggest a few different things. Fin12 could have splintered, and UNC2727 has some of the original members. Or it could be that Fin12's membership or partnerships changed and they adopted new TTPs, or even just adopted new TTPs to maintain a lower profile. So despite all these compelling overlaps with all the unknowns, we continue to track these two separately. So now that we've discussed the 4 key factors, attribution threshold, attribution granularity, visibility, and changes over time, Emiel's going to walk us through a case study.
I think my coworkers in the room probably see where this is going. I'm back with APT42. So for the last few minutes of the presentation, we'll kind of try to weave these 4 factors about why Rosetta Stones can be elusive into an example and a case study. So let's first revisit sort of the open source names or the aliases and the mapping of those. We'll focus on the Venn diagram on the right. And so when you look at this, you immediately see, okay, we've assessed that APT42 is roughly correspondent with TA453, it's the Proofpoint name, ITG18 for IBM, or Yellow Garuda for PwC. Now, this APT42 group sits more or less adjacent to what Mandiant tracks as UNC2448, Microsoft tracks as Dev0270, and CrowdStrike tracks as Nemesis Kitten. UNC2448 is an organization or a cluster that we, in our APT42 reporting, have also kind of explained and assessed is related to 2 front companies in Iran. And these are the same 2 companies that were indicted and sanctioned on September 14 by the United States government. When you combine UNC2448 and APT42, you roughly get what Microsoft calls phosphorus, at least based on open source reporting. I obviously don't know their full data set, right? Again, one of those, you can make a Venn diagram without all the data, that can be difficult. Now, the APT35 on the right is Mandiant's APT35, and there's a tiny bit of overlap in that diagram, and that's on purpose, and we'll get to why that is at the end. And then you have the broader sort of overlapping circle that is Charming Kitten and APT35. Now, this is a challenging one because various vendors have used the label Charming Kitten. Various vendors have used the label APT35 for things that we track as APT42, which can be confusing. And because there's a lot of organizations that track Charming Kitten, you can also ask, whose Charming Kitten are we talking about? But that doesn't quite translate well to a pretty Venn diagram, so I left that out. So when we talk about APT35 and APT42 and why we think they're different, we can summarize it with this statement on the slide. We've assessed with moderate confidence that both APT35 and APT42 originate from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but that they originate from different missions and contracts or contractors based on substantial differences in their respective targeting patterns and TTPs over time. So we'll explore these differences a little bit together. The first factor here that's important is when did we first start tracking them, and do we still track them now? So APT35 and APT42 became active for us in our data sets in 2014 and 2015, respectively. We still see APT42 every day. I saw them yesterday. APT35 I have not seen since 2019, though there's some adjacent clusters, for lack of a better word, that you might know in open sources as tortoiseshell that still kind of operate in this space. When we talk about targeting patterns, I think this is a really interesting thing to take note of as well. You know, APT35 in its original form as newscaster team, its TTPs were actually quite similar to APT42. There was a lot of sophisticated and patient social engineering, particularly of government officials, diplomats, journalists, researchers, and so on. But it didn't stop there, right? Their operations also included password spraying, web shells, custom malware, exploitation of one-days, right? And they were doing this in intrusions targeting the defense industrial base, construction companies, the energy sector, oil and gas, technology, and so on. For anyone that's read the APT42 report, that's simply not what APT42 does. They are heavily focused on patient social engineering. They kind of try to build trust with their targets, sometimes talking to them for weeks or months before they deliver anything malicious. And they do so to try to obtain access to corporate or personal email accounts, and then go from there. They also have a subset of activity that is using Android malware, and they target individuals primarily in Iran, again, dissidents, opposition figures, activists, former government officials, and so on. And we actually have some indication that individuals targeted with this Android malware end up being arrested by law enforcement forces in Iran. So that's something to take in mind too when we talk about, you know, where does APT42 sit in the Iranian apparatus. The third factor here, or the third difference here, is malware overlaps. Now I say difference in the same sentence as overlaps, which is maybe a little bit of a contrary, but we did see both of these clusters use what we call magic drop, a dropper, for Brokyok, which is a downloader. Now the difference here is that for APT35, we saw them use magic drop and Brokyok across 2016 to 2018, multiple vectors, several intrusions where Mandiant was present, and we saw them use this, you know, hands-on keyboard activity. We saw them operationalize it all the time. With APT42, we have two samples of each malware family attributed. The hard-coded command and control reaches out to infrastructure that looks substantially different from what APT35 was using. We also never saw them operationalize it. That might be a problem with our visibility, right? Certainly possible. But again, we don't have the data. We don't do the attribution, right? We don't do attribution just on malware overlap. So we didn't have the intrusion data there. It did not meet our threshold to connect the two. And then finally, let's consider the institutional reality in Iran as well. I've already brought up contractors before. UNC 2448 is a phenomenal and very recent example. But we know that both the civilian and military intelligence apparatus loves to use contractors in Iran. There's multiple indictments and sanctions that will point this out publicly. So we have to, again, consider that perhaps there's a possibility that these two groups originate from different contractors, different contracts executed by the same contractor, or maybe they're just sister teams in one unit or multiple units in the same institutional entity. So that kind of wraps up all of the different elements of why we keep APT35 and APT42 separate, and hopefully that kind of brought home all the different factors of why these four factors of attribution granularity, visibility, changes over time, and thresholds relate to these two groups. Now, when you want to bring this back to our analogy with the ship of Theseus, you could say the component parts changed over time. The one ship evolved into two ships, or maybe it's still the same ship, or maybe it doesn't matter at all because it's still a ship that floats. I'll pass it over to Genevieve for concluding thoughts.
Thank you. So at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that we were going to share some tips for tackling these challenges. So let's actually do that. So the first thing I would like to suggest is that you maintain an analytical platform that allows you to model these overlaps. Model things like multiple names for a thing. We have an AKA tagging system that allows us to do something like Microsoft tracks this file as part of the Wingbird malware ecosystem, and CrowdStrike attributes this file to Spicy Panda. And let's say Palo Alto says that these URLs were used in the Top Hat campaign. And so we can make a quick query or two to determine what names things are tracked under and see with granularity what those known overlaps are. If you're a smaller shop and you don't have the resources to do all of that OSINT triage and data modeling, then insist that that's something you're getting from your Intel provider. If you are an Intel provider, number one, use your own naming scheme. There are multiple reasons for this. As someone that has to write media news analysis comments, I can tell you it's really awkward when I have to say that thing you say is FIN11 is not. But overall, it just helps us show that these things are based on our own visibility, and they will be different. That doesn't mean that you can't note overlaps or cite other organizations' work. Definitely do that. And if you have details on what you think the overlaps are, provide that. Next, share indicators. If you're talking about malware, ideally that is in a public malware repository that people can grab the bytes for and do their own analysis on to see if it's something that they're already tracking under a different name. In terms of hashes, please provide some context, not just a list. This file is part of this malware family, and this URL was used as C2 for this other malware family. Again, that helps with those mappings. And of course, if you're sharing indicators, they should not be in an image. It should be easy for people to ingest those ISEs. The last one's really hard for me personally as an introvert, but reach out to these originating organizations. Say, I saw this thing and it looks like what you track as this group. What are your thoughts? I think actually you have a great example recently of where you had some collaboration that led to some good results.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a recent example where a peer of mine at a different company, they put out a blog and they said, hey, we have this other hash that relates to this. We call it TA453. But we couldn't quite put it in a blog, just wanted you to have it. And said, okay, great, run it through our systems, and I noticed we actually saw that hash, that file, delivered in a spear phishing message to a relatively important customer. So I think, all right, okay, now we're talking, great. But the problem was the file reached out to infrastructure that belonged to yet another company. So I reached out to that second company and said, hey, Proofpoint calls this TA453, roughly means APT42 for us, but I just have the file. I can't attribute this to APT42 myself. Can you help me? And he said, yep, this URL you provided me redirects to this other URL that hosts a credential harvesting page. Lo and behold, that credential harvesting page was hosted on a domain that I actually could attribute to APT42. So he closed the loop there, and I went back to my original contact and said, hey, that hash you shared with me, I can confidently say we have this APT42 as well, right? So we kind of make sure that we were tracking with our own labels and confirming our own attribution, and that led us to be able to actually help that customer and make sure that they weren't compromised.
Thank you.
I just want to tack on to the indication sharing. When you are sharing indicators, providing the context is helpful. When you're applying those AKA tags that we recommend folks do, I recommend that you don't do it holistically on the group. Don't try to fit it into a one-for-one for all the reasons that we talked about today. Do it at the indicator level. You will be shocked about how things will deviate across vendors over time. So highly encourage you to do it at a granular level. I know we use that word a lot today. Do it on the indicators. Provide that context. Do assessments when you are looking for, let's say you're a consumer of CTI. Ask yourself, what type of access does this vendor actually have? Are they going to give me the insight into intrusion operations that I'm looking for? Or maybe I'm not interested in that because of my use case. I've got a different use case. Maybe I'm actually only concerned about stuff that can be derived from underground forums, right? But if you are the type of organization that's intimately interested in understanding how adversaries conduct intrusions, you're going to want to go with a vendor that investigates intrusions. That's my pitch. We'll turn over to questions now if there are any.
So the naming scheme at Mandiant is to use APT or UNC and a number. Have you considered using a naming scheme that would reflect the relationship between, for instance, APT 35 and APT 42, similarly to how COVID strains are scientifically labeled?
We've very specifically decided against codifying assessments into threat group names. The closest we come to that is the FIN versus APT designator, and even that is tricky with things like APT 41. So yeah, I think they considered a lot of schemes over the years, and we continue to reevaluate that, and every once in a while someone's like, but it's hard to remember. It's not memorable. But from an analytical standpoint, this really works well because if we change our assessments later, we don't have to worry about like, oh, now we can't call the group this.
Yeah, I agreed, Genevieve. Also, she mentioned there are groups that do participate in both. Groups actually physically move, which is also interesting. You also run into like the limits of that. And I personally think there's more value to the analyst to not have it be memorable. The way we actually model our data, those overlaps should emerge, for us. We shouldn't actually have an image in our head of what this is. And so it actually helps keep us honest. So it's one of those probably unintentional things that we've found great value in.
And I think specifically to like the APT 35, 42 like aspect of that, I think it's challenging because we can make the assessment that maybe they originate from contractors that have some kind of relationship or a shared malware developer, and that explains that the malware overlap that I talked about. But I don't know how you succinctly codify that into a name without leaving room then for, hey, a year from now we find new data from APT 42 intrusions that actually gives us more, and we want to change that assessment. So I think that's a difficult element there in terms of like leaving room for those assessments to change over time as well.
So understand there's some edge case overlap between nation-state activity and cybercriminal activity, but noting the fundamental difference in the way these two things operate. Because we try to name everything. Should we have completely separate ways of attributing and naming and looking at nation-state cyber threat actor activity versus this chaotic, dynamic cybercrime infrastructure, which is more like almost cloud, not in the good sense like AWS, but in the bad sense?
I think actually, I'll take it a step further. I think you have to look at everything as unique, right? There's a lot of generalities that we like to throw out. Adversaries will or will not do this, right? Nation states will or will not do this. I think those generalities don't serve anyone, actually. So when we're looking at how we're including certain components into a group, it's unique every time. That's my personal view. The components that make up FIN 7 are not the same considerations that we're looking at for like a FIN 12 or a FIN 11. They're just fundamentally different. The nuance really does matter to us. And so one of the things that we're constantly looking at is, hey, how do we apply an attribution standard? I think the standard needs to be in the rigor, right? All the factors that Emiel talked about, that you want to have high standards. But when we start talking about like, we're going to have this cookie cutter template for nation states, this template for fin crime, it just doesn't work out that way. Hopefully that answers your question.
And we do have the APT FIN break, right?
Yeah.
We promote a threat group, it goes to an APT or a FIN. And that is a little bit of a misnomer because you do have financially motivated activity under the APT side, and you have some pretty advanced activity occasionally under the fin crime side. I look at it as more of a sponsorship split. If we think that there is government sponsorship, whether it's for revenue generation for DPRK or, APT 41 kind of having a toe in both. What's the phrase?
I'm sorry?
There's a phrase about having like a toe in both, I don't know, it doesn't matter. They do their thing. That is where we really draw the line because there is financially motivated activity that is not covered by our fin crime group, it's covered by our espionage team.
That is time. If there's any follow-up questions or if you just want to chat, we'll be in the back. Thank you, folks.